Don't believe the hype that this is just another Trump tariff headline, because what happened this week isn't random. It's a pattern, and it's escalating. On January 24th, 2026, Trump publicly threatened a 100% tariff on Canada if Ottawa follows through on a trade deal with China. Not a small penalty, it's a political ultimatum. Then, on January 27th, 2026, Trump said he's raising tariffs on South Korea to 25%, up from 15%, and he's not hiding the reason. Seoul's legislature hasn't ratified a trade deal the U.S. says was agreed last year. So no, this isn't trade policy. This is leverage. This is compliance. This is the White House turning tariffs into a timer. Do the thing or pay the price. And the target list matters. Autos, lumber, pharmaceuticals. Exactly the kind of sectors that hit jobs, prices, and corporate lobbies fast. Now here's the part most people miss. Trump isn't just pressuring South Korea. He's sending a message to every U.S. ally watching this unfold. Deals aren't real until your domestic politics obey them, because South Korea's trade pact, according to reporting, was tied to major promises, including hundreds of billions in South Korean investment in the U.S. In exchange, tariffs were eased. The White House position now is simple. You got the benefit, where's the ratification? And in Trump's world, legislative delay is treated like betrayal. Let's zoom out. In the span of days, Trump puts Canada under a choose America or China threat, 100% tariffs, and then he hits South Korea with a 25% tariff hike to force movement on a deal. That's not a trade dispute. That's a doctrine. Tariffs as discipline. So what happens next? First, Seoul has to respond, and it's a tight box. If South Korea retaliates, it risks deepening the fight. If it rushes ratification, it looks like it bent the knee to U.S. pressure. And if you want to know why markets care, look at the exposure. South Korea's biggest export story into the U.S. is heavily tied to manufacturing, especially vehicles and supply chain-linked goods. Reuters notes the tariff hike would hit major automakers. Second, this is a warning shot to other partners with domestic politics that move slowly. Because if Trump is willing to punish a close ally over parliamentary timing, everyone else is reading that as, we're one vote away from your tariff rate changing. Third, the Canada angle is not separate. It's connected. Trump's Canada threat wasn't subtle. Sign with China, get 100% tariffs. That is an attempt to police not only what allies export to the U.S., but who allies are allowed to align with economically. And when you pair that with the South Korea move, the real headline becomes, tariffs are now being used as a foreign policy border wall. Now let's talk about what this means on the ground, because viewers feel tariffs in the boring places first. If tariffs on autos and components rise, you get upward pressure on pricing and supply decisions. If tariffs on pharmaceuticals rise, you get anxiety in healthcare supply channels. And lumber? That flows straight into construction and housing costs. Politically sensitive always. And here's the political genius and the political danger of targeting those categories. They hurt fast, and they create lobbying pressure fast. So the 25% number isn't just an economic number. It's a deadline with a price tag. And according to Reuters, the tariff move surprised Seoul and added tension to U.S.-South Korea economic relations. Exactly the kind of uncertainty companies hate when they're planning production and investment. So, what's Trump trying to achieve? Option 1, force ratification. Get the legislature to move, then declare victory. Option 2, extract new concessions. Not just ratification, but extra commitments, extra purchases, extra guarantees. Option 3, normalize volatility. Make the world trade system feel like it runs through one switchboard, his. Now here's what you should watch next, because this story moves in signals. Watch South Korea's response. Do they announce emergency talks? Do they fast-track legislative action? Do they threaten countermeasures? Watch Canada's posture. Do they downplay a China deal? Do they pivot to domestic-first messaging? Reuters reports Canada's Prime Minister urged Canadians to buy domestic products while not directly addressing the threat. And watch the markets, because traders don't trade ideology, they trade risk. When tariff policy becomes unpredictable, it gets priced like geopolitical instability. Now, let me land this with the bigger truth. The Live Updates headline makes this feel like a moment. It's not a moment, it's a method. Tariffs used as enforcement tools to shape ally behavior toward China and to force domestic institutions abroad to move on Washington's timeline. And if that's the direction we're heading, then the real question isn't, will tariffs go up or down? The real question is, which country is next? And what will Washington demand when it does it? Because once tariffs stop being about trade balances and start being about obedience, every ally becomes a potential target, and every delay becomes a trigger. And that's why this South Korea move matters more than the number 25. It's the signal. The rules are changing. Again. And the world is watching who blinks first. But here's the deeper layer most headlines won't touch. This strategy only works if everyone believes the threat is real. And Trump is making sure they do. Because tariffs can be announced in a press conference, but credibility is built by repetition. Canada, South Korea, earlier moves against Mexico, previous shocks to Europe. Each action reinforces the same lesson. This administration is willing to absorb friction to force outcomes. That changes behavior long before tariffs actually bite. Finance ministers don't wait for damage. Corporate boards don't wait for certainty. They move preemptively, rerouting supply chains, delaying investments, freezing hiring, pressuring their own governments to resolve the issue. That's the invisible effect. And it's why this approach is so powerful and so destabilizing, because it turns allies into risk managers instead of partners. Now think about the timing. These moves are happening while global trade is already fragile. Supply chains are stretched, shipping insurance costs are volatile, and inflation sensitivity is high. In that environment, uncertainty itself becomes the weapon. Trump understands this. He doesn't need permanent tariffs. He just needs the possibility of tariffs hanging over every negotiation. That's why volatility isn't a bug in this system. It's the feature, but there's a limit, because every time tariffs are used as punishment rather than protection, trust erodes, and trust is the invisible infrastructure of the global economy. Once allies start planning around the assumption that Washington may suddenly change the rules, they begin building alternatives. Not immediately, not loudly, but quietly, diversifying markets, signing regional agreements, reducing exposure where they can. That doesn't weaken America overnight, but it changes the long-term geometry of power. And here's the irony. This strategy is designed to counter China's influence, but it also teaches countries the same lesson China learned years ago: dependence is dangerous. Which brings us back to the core tension. Trump wants speed, he wants alignment, he wants leverage, but the global system runs on predictability, process, and gradual consensus. Those two logics are colliding. And South Korea is now standing directly at that fault line. Whatever Seoul does next will matter far beyond tariffs. It will signal whether major U.S. allies believe resistance is possible or whether compliance is the safer path. Canada's response will matter too, not because of the China deal itself, but because of whether Ottawa accepts the premise that alignment can be enforced through economic threat. And every other capital, from Tokyo to Berlin to Canberra, is watching closely. Because once a doctrine is demonstrated, it spreads. Today it's tariffs tied to ratification. Tomorrow it could be tariffs tied to investment rules, or data regulations, or technology controls, or foreign partnerships Washington doesn't like. That's why this moment matters, not because of the percentage, not because of the headline, but because it answers a question the world has been quietly asking since Trump returned to office. Is this approach situational or structural? If it's situational, it fades with the next deal. If it's structural, then the global trade system has entered a new phase, one where power is exercised not through institutions, but through pressure. And once that becomes normalized, there's no easy way back. So the next few moves won't just resolve a tariff dispute, they'll define expectations. They'll tell us whether allies believe they still have room to maneuver, or whether the cost of hesitation has become too high. Because in this system, delay isn't neutral. Delay is defiance. And defiance now has a price. The question is, who decides they can afford to pay it? And there's one more consequence that rarely gets discussed, but it may be the most dangerous one. When tariffs become a tool for enforcing political behavior, they stop being negotiable instruments and start functioning like sanctions. And sanctions change how states think about sovereignty because trade disputes can be settled. Sanctions signal moral judgment, hierarchy, and punishment. That distinction matters. Once a country feels it's being disciplined rather than negotiated with, the relationship shifts psychologically. It's no longer about mutual benefit, it's about autonomy. And autonomy, once questioned, becomes a national security issue. This is where escalation risk quietly enters the picture. Not military escalation, not yet, but economic nationalism hardening into political resistance. South Korea's domestic debate will not be limited to tariffs. It will widen into questions about strategic dependence, supply chain exposure, and how much leverage any single partner should have. Canada's conversation will do the same, so will others. And when multiple allies begin asking the same question at the same time, how exposed are we? How fast can we reduce that exposure? The system begins to shift underneath the surface, slowly, incrementally, but irreversibly. This is how fragmentation starts, not with a dramatic rupture, but with quiet hedging. Now add one more layer. Trump's approach assumes that economic pressure always flows downhill, that the United States can apply pain faster than it can receive it. In many cases, that's true, but not in all. Modern supply chains are circular. Pressure applied to one node often rebounds somewhere unexpected. Consumer prices, corporate earnings, investor confidence, allied cooperation in unrelated domains. Tariffs don't stay in their lane. And when allies feel coerced, cooperation in other areas becomes transactional. Security commitments get reevaluated. Diplomatic flexibility shrinks. Goodwill evaporates. None of this shows up in a tariff schedule, but it shows up later when coordination suddenly becomes harder than it used to be. This is the trade-off embedded in the strategy: speed versus stability, control versus consent. Trump is betting that speed wins, that outcomes achieved quickly matter more than relationships managed carefully. And in the short term, that bet often pays off. Governments move, deals get signed, markets adjust, but over time, systems remember. They remember who applied pressure, they remember who absorbed it, and they quietly reorganize to avoid being in that position again. That's why this moment matters beyond South Korea, beyond Canada, beyond tariffs. It's about whether the world is entering an era where economic alignment is enforced rather than negotiated, where hesitation is penalized, where domestic political processes abroad are treated as obstacles to be overridden. If that becomes normal, then every future deal carries an unspoken clause: move fast or else. And once that expectation sets in, it reshapes global behavior in ways no single administration can fully control. So when people ask whether this strategy is strong or reckless, they're asking the wrong question. The real question is whether it's sustainable, because power used frequently must eventually be resisted, absorbed, or diluted. And the way other countries respond now, not loudly, not theatrically, but structurally, will determine whether this approach hardens into a lasting doctrine or burns itself out under the weight of its own pressure. That's the real story still unfolding. Not a tariff hike, not a threat, but a test of how much pressure the global system can take before it starts pushing back. And that brings us to the end game, because every pressure strategy eventually reveals what it is really testing. This one isn't testing trade balances, it isn't testing legislative speed, it isn't even testing loyalty, it's testing tolerance. How much uncertainty can allies absorb before they decide the relationship itself needs to be re-engineered? How many times can tariffs be used as a disciplinary tool before countries stop treating them as exceptions and start treating them as the new normal? Once that mental shift happens, behavior changes permanently. Governments begin insulating critical sectors. Companies redesign supply chains around political risk, not efficiency. Allies stop assuming alignment and start calculating exposure. And when that happens, leverage weakens, not because the tool disappears, but because everyone learns how to live under its shadow. That's the paradox at the heart of this approach. The more effective tariffs become as a threat, the faster others learn to blunt their impact. You can already see the early signs: more regional trade discussions, more strategic autonomy language, more quiet conversations about redundancy, diversification, and decoupling, not just from China, but from overdependence on any single partner. None of this explodes overnight, it accumulates. And when it does surface, it often looks sudden: a failed negotiation, a stalled alliance, a refusal that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. That's when people will look back at moments like this and realize what they were watching: not a tariff dispute, not a negotiating tactic, but the stress test of a system that's been taken for granted for decades. Trump's strategy assumes that pressure produces clarity, that forcing choices creates order, that uncertainty is something others will fear more than Washington does. That may be true for now, but systems under constant pressure don't stay rigid. They adapt, they bend, and eventually they find ways to redistribute the strain. So the final outcome won't be decided by a single vote in Seoul, or a single decision in Ottawa, or a single market reaction. It will be decided by accumulation, by how many times this method is used, by how many actors feel exposed, by how many quietly decide that the cost of compliance today may be higher than the cost of resistance tomorrow. That's why this story doesn't really end with South Korea or Canada or even tariffs. It ends with a question that will define the next phase of the global order. Can a system built on cooperation survive when compliance is enforced through pressure, or does pressure eventually create the very fragmentation it's meant to prevent? The answer won't come in a headline. It won't come in a press conference. It will emerge slowly through choices made behind closed doors, choices about where to invest, who to trust, and how much dependence is too much. And by the time that answer becomes obvious, the rules will already have changed. That's the real significance of this moment. Not who blinked first, but who quietly started preparing for a world where blinking is no longer an option.